Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Mikkel Thorpe, and this is the Expat Money Show. Today's guest is the opinion editor of antiwar.com, news editor of the Libertarian Institute, and co-host of the podcast Conflicts of Interest. Please welcome to the show, Kyle Anzalone. Kyle, how are you?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me on your program.
Well, pleasure is all mine. I'm really excited for today's conversation. Why don't you start us off by kind of explaining a little bit how you got into this type of work and a bit about your backstory?
Yeah, I guess so. It would go back to 2009 when I discovered Ron Paul. I was in college at the time, so I had plenty of time to, read just endless books on philosophy. And I really immersed myself in the libertarian philosophy. And the last thing that I finally let go of was my idea that we need this massive war state, that we need this massive army, even though I was a, Ron Paul libertarian going into the 2012 campaign cycle. He really hadn't sold me on the anti-war point yet. I was, very much in the Fed, we need to get rid of all these taxes, all these regulations, the CDC, all these three-letter agencies are absolutely awful, but we do need the military to protect us, and we do need to be involved in overseas. And so really challenged myself on that and, just read more and more and more, and eventually came across Scott Horton, who at that time was the opinion editor of antiwar.com. And I started listening to his show pretty regularly. After I graduated college, I had a job where I was driving around probably like 4 or 5 hours a day. And so I had a lot of time to listen to podcasts. And at that time, there weren't a ton of libertarian podcasts. So I would listen to, pretty much everything that Scott Horton had put out. And over time, I had really developed a sense of how destructive the U.S. foreign policy was in the Middle East. And at that same time, I went through a transition in my career, and I ended up working at a therapy school where I was, doing behavioral stuff for kids who had mostly trauma in their past, either inner city kids or kids that just had some horrible things happen to them. And I also had written my thesis in college on the moral development of children. And I kind of just had this moment where everything kind of fell into place for me. And I understood that for moral development to happen, not just on an individual level, but on a societal level, there has to be good people challenging the rest of society. And when you drop bombs on a society and you wreck and you devastate a society, those people never come to the fore. And so when you do things like destroy Yemen for 7 years from 2015 until 2022, just bomb it constantly, and you think about the impact that not only has on this first generation of children who are all going to grow up with PTSD, and there's repercussions from that, right? They're more likely to have serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar. They're more likely to develop addictions. They're more likely to be involved in violence, either committing it or on the receiving end of it. And then, of course, their children are more likely to be subject to violence if they were aggressed against in some way themselves. And so you could really see how this could infect and poison and destroy entire societies by waging these kinds of wars on them. And I realized it wasn't, just in Yemen. It was Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Palestine. All these places had just been absolutely devastated by the endless U.S. wars. And that's a part of the reason why in 2022, when the Ukraine war was just getting started, I was saying, please, let's negotiate an end to this thing. Let's not get into this endless entrenched war that is not only going to, harm Ukraine and Russia for years into the future, but really is going to, inflict this poison of militarism into their society. And I think we see that to some extent in the U.S., even though there's not war waged against us. There's a lot of other countries that have a lot of guns, and not all of them have the same violence, murder, suicide rates as you have in the United States. And I think a good part of that is how much militarism has infested and inflicted our society. And so around 2016, it got to be too much that I couldn't just assume this content. I had to start putting out a little content myself, right? And so I started a podcast. Eventually, I just had a blogger job at the Libertarian Institute after Scott Horton founded that. And I just pursued that for a few years. Eventually, he suggested that I could possibly fill his role as opinion editor of antiwar.com. And I started that job in 2019. And I've essentially been doing the same thing day in and day out. I really learned how to write articles. And so I became a writer. The one thing I knew I didn't want to do when I left high school was to write. I thought I hated it. I was like, oh, I could work construction or just about anything as long as I don't have to write. And now I do it every day and I absolutely love it.
Well, okay. So on your last point there, I think that's quite funny because I'm a dyslexic and dropped out of school when I was 12 years old. And what do I do for a living? I write. I mean, that's like my main thing is write and speak. So it's just funny how that comes in. So you mentioned something that's extremely interesting to me and actually not one that I've necessarily thought of before. And that's that, many other countries have guns in the world, and a lot of people blame the violence that happens in the United States, the school shootings and all of these types of things on the guns themselves, which I think is complete nonsense. But your point that it happens because of a lot of the psychological damage that happens because of the conflicts that the United States are involved with overseas, that a lot of that permeates back into the society. So that's a pretty, interesting idea and not one that I'd really considered before. Let's dig into that a little bit more.
Yeah. So, and actually my boss at antiwar.com, the webmaster for the site, one of the co-founders, Eric Garris, who just happened to be talking to me about this morning because we were talking about Michael Moore and his movie Bowling for Columbine. And one of the things that he points out in that movie is that ammunition was actually far more accessible, readily available in Canada at the time than the US, but only the US has these mass shootings. If you look at a lot of the people who are guilty of, the violence in our country, it is, Timothy McVeigh was a former veteran. We had a veteran in Maine not that long ago engaged in a mass shooting. A lot of the violence is caused by blowback terrorism. So say Omar Mateen, the 9/11 hijackers, right? Or even a lot of our police officers are former military veterans themselves, and they bring the training and the actions that they were using overseas when they were occupying, say, Iraq or Afghanistan back home and treat Americans that way. And so, I think that's a lot of it. Also, just, if you look at veteran suicides, that's another really good example of this. This is not something that happens in other countries. A lot of times when people talk about gun deaths in the United States, they use a number that I think is like 40,000 and includes suicides by gun, which happen all the time in the veteran community. And so, there's a lot of ways in which I think this militarism really comes back home.
Well, it's one of these things that I've never really understood, because I mean, if I say something and I hurt someone else's feelings, like I'm like thinking about it all day long. Like I lose sleep over if there was someone out there and I hurt them with my actions, like I genuinely I can't sleep over it. Like I'm sick to my stomach. So the thought of actually doing violence to someone else, like murder, is just so beyond my comprehension. I'm not saying that I'm a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist. I have 3 gorgeous children. I have a wife that I love and adore. And if someone came and meant us harm, I would absolutely stand between them and I would prevent that from happening at any cost. I would protect them fully. But the thought of going out there and into another country and shooting at them is just beyond what my brain is able to comprehend.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it has to do in maybe the military industrial complex also includes the media, and this is, I think, the role the media plays. For people like me and you who consume alternative media, we really don't understand that mindset. But for people who watch CNN all day long, they're terrified that Donald Trump is going to come into office and deport anybody browner than myself or something like that. They're seriously concerned about that, even though that was never on the table. That's never anything anybody ever talked about. And I remember the same thing happened to me, how conditioned I was as a kid. One of the first times I got on a flight after 9/11, I was 18. I was like 11 when 9/11 happened. And then I, flew at 18. And there were some people who were obviously Muslim on the flight with me. And I remember just having this like instinctual fear hit me, like, what are these people going to do? Like, are they potentially dangerous being on this plane? And I think so much of that happened because I grew up during the terror war, where day after day I was told that we have to be in Iraq, killing all these people. Millions of people, have died in Iraq now, about a million of them from the conflict. But when you talk about the number of people displaced in the Middle East, we're in the tens of thousands at this point, like between 32 and 53 million people were displaced at some point in time. And when you displace large groups of people end up dying of deprivation and things that, somebody has to flee into the desert and they have diabetes or something like that, and they can't get insulin or things like that, they end up dying. Like, these things happen pretty frequently. And so when you look at the excess death rate, is a lot higher than the actual rate of death from these wars. But I mean, we're just talking about massive numbers of people being killed. And then when we go and turn on TV and we're supposed to hear like the opinions of our enlightened leaders explain to us why we have to do this, they say it's because if we're not doing this, people will come here and they will kill you, or they will kill your parents, they will kill your children. Like, this is what they tell people. The same way when COVID was spreading, right? They told us that if you go outside, you will kill your grandmother. And I love my grandmother. And, I was like, should I not go see her? If I'm in town and she's in town, should we not get together? Do I want to have that moral responsibility? That, this is the conditioning that they put in people, and it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes at times years, right? The run up to the Iraq war, 9/11 was in 2001. The invasion was in 2003. It took 16, 18 months to get the American people militarized enough against the Muslim community writ large that they're willing to go to war, when none of the hijackers were from Iraq, and go to war when none of their hijackers are from Iraq in the first place. And so, I think this is kind of the piece of, you had to consume CNN, Fox News, these mainstream media sites or sources, or else you're just not going to understand the mentality of the people who don't, because there's so much conditioning there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the largest psyops. I mean, you've just given two excellent examples of massive psyops perpetrated by the government to brainwash people and to think that, it's to normalize something like this, where it's actually disgusting behavior. I started traveling in 2000. So a lot of this stuff I missed. I was overseas. Like, I was in Morocco, a Muslim country, for 2 months when I was 19 years old, backpacking around Muslim countries. I lived in the Middle East for almost a decade and met some of the most lovely, down to earth, hospitable, generous human beings in my entire life in these types of countries. So the idea to vilify entire cultures is just so foul to me and just does not make any sense.
Yeah. Well, I often make this point. So again, I was about 11 years old on 9/11. My birthday's in October, so I guess I was 10 and quite a bit of change. And the first time I saw an Afghan child was on South Park. So I don't know when exactly that episode came out, when they end up, the kids end up going to Afghanistan. But, for years and years and years, we're bombing Afghanistan, and they just keep showing you pictures of Osama bin Laden, who's not even an Afghan. He's an Arab from Saudi Arabia. I had no idea. I thought Afghans looked like Osama bin Laden. I thought they were all big, tall, skinny, dark dudes who wore diapers on their head. I was really confused whenever, you see South Park and there's like kids. I'm like, oh, wait, there's kids in Afghanistan. Like, but if the news doesn't show you that, if they don't show you the suffering of the people, then you never realize it's happening, when all they're showing you is, oh, terrorism, you got to go get these people. These people are bad. These people are dangerous.
Well, and it's interesting, I'm having you on the program today to specifically talk, about what is happening in the world, the geopolitics, and a lot of the war that's going on in the world. But from my standpoint, I also feel like I have a moral obligation to talk about these types of things, because a lot of my clients are Canadians and Americans, and a lot of their tax dollars are going to fund things like this. So, in a lot of the work that we do, when we move people to another country, we're moving them to peaceful countries that don't have standing militaries, or if they have a military, it's not for invading other countries. So, we try to take care of the tax situation in your home country and bring that as close to zero as humanly possible. And, hopefully all tax as close to zero as possible. But at least if you have to pay something, let's not have it go towards war. So this is the main reason that I think that our conversation today is so massively, massively important, because people are comparable for these types of things that happen if you are still in a situation where you're funding this war machine.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point. And there's a lot of ways that the government's able to print money and, get money to fund their wars. But, eventually the bills will come due, and the less revenue they have, the more cuts they will have to make one day.
Absolutely. And even if it's just a small amount, my very, very small piece on planet Earth, I think that it is, the Lord's work here. Starve the beast. I mean, absolutely. I'm for this so fully, so committed. on every single level to starve the beast.
Yeah. Well, the US empire is such a massive beast, right? That it's going to take a lot of different actions to starve it and to bring it back down to size, right? Like, I don't want to see anything bad happen to the United States. I just want our empire to end, right? I want to bring our soldiers home. I want to bring our bases home. We could trade with everyone. I want to trade with all countries, including Russia or Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. There's plenty of reasons to trade with all these countries and to have open relations with them, and to the extent possible, influence their people to be more as free as they possibly can be, not in the CIA color revolution kind of way, just in the, if you're having a conversation with a guy in Cuba, like, tell him about why capitalism is a better system than socialism, but, don't tell him that he in support and start sending arms to the revolutionaries in his country or something like that. Try some kind of coup or something crazy. But yeah, I'm definitely for, doing what we can to starve the beast and to bring the US empire back and turn the America back into a republic like it was meant to be.
100%. I mean, I've had some of the best times in my life in the United States. Some of my best friends, clients are Americans. I never blame an American, but I do not like what the federal government is doing on any level. So if you guys ever hear me or think that you are hearing me bash Americans, you've got it incorrect. I'm not bashing Americans. I'm bashing the federal government, which I think is vile.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. Anything we could do to bring the US empire down to size is a great thing.
So let's get into what is happening in the world. And this is kind of an interesting thing for me because I have actually my wife and I have just had our third child. So I've been kind of out of the day-to-day geopolitics for a little bit of time right now, where normally I follow these things intensely. But at the moment, family first, we've got a brand new baby, he sleeps with us. So that's kind of waking me up a little bit in the night. So we're trying to catch up on some sleep here and there. But I'm genuinely interested what's happening in the world right now.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a lot going on in the world right now. Would you like to start in Europe with Ukraine, Middle East?
Let's go from Middle East because that's kind of where we just left off of your journey towards these types of things. But I do want to understand what is happening in Ukraine at the moment, as well as anything that we can discuss for China. My wife is from mainland China, so I'm always very concerned about the escalation with the Taiwan Strait.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I guess starting in the Middle East, there's certainly a lot going on, and all of it really revolves around Israel and its military operations in Gaza. And so at this point in time, Israel has really worked its way from north to south in the Gaza Strip. And if anybody wants to look at a map, you can see it's like a rectangular piece of land that is situated in southern Israel along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. There is a border between Egypt and Gaza. So it's not all that, Israel controls every single border crossing. However, as of today, they have invaded the southern city of Rafah and have taken control of that last border crossing with Egypt. Now, before that, Egypt was allowing Israel to inspect, and anything that went through that Rafah crossing would have to cross through southern Israel in their inspections first, then would travel into Egypt and then finally into Gaza. But now Israel has just seized that Rafah border crossing. So Israel has worked north to south in Gaza and has really decimated every city along the way. There's one city left in Gaza that hasn't been completely leveled. That is Rafah. And Israel started their operations, I guess it would technically be last night. Last week, they basically gave Hamas a 1-week notice. They said, release our hostages, accept a hostage deal to release our hostages, or else we will invade. Over the weekend, Hamas did agree to that, but Israel said they didn't agree to Hamas's version of the truce, and so it didn't apply. And then they dropped leaflets on the city and immediately started bombing. There's about 1.4 to 1.7 million people crammed into Rafah right now. It's kind of unclear on the numbers just because, Gaza is an enclave of 2.3 million people, and about 90 to 95% of the people are displaced. And so it's really hard to identify where everybody is living. Cindy McCain, the widow of John McCain, who now heads the UN World Food Program. So this is not a peacenik. This is not somebody in our camp. This is somebody well entrenched in the establishment, as well as Samantha Power, who heads up USAID, have both said that there's a famine happening in the northern half of the Gaza Strip. Now, by the international definition of famine, that means 2 per 10,000 people are dying every day of deprivation. I don't know exactly what metric the US is using, and I would guess there's like 300,000 to 500,000 people in northern Gaza. So we are talking about dozens, scores of people dying every day in northern Gaza from the famine. And then in the southern half, again, in Rafah, you have the military campaign going on. So let me know where I could maybe elaborate more.
No, I mean, it's just these types of numbers are so staggering that it just makes me sick to my stomach. So are any peace talks happening? Is there anything diplomatic going on at the moment with this?
Not at the moment. Over the weekend, the U.S. was really pressing to get a last-minute hostage deal done. The deal that was on the table was 33 of, I believe, the last civilian hostages that are held by either Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the two main armed groups in Gaza. So there's about 130 hostages left. I believe about 33 of them are civilians. The rest are military. So, one thing that kind of gets left out of the whole October 7th narrative is about half of the people that Hamas killed on that day were soldiers. About half, I think a little less than half of the people who were captured were soldiers. Now, Israel will kind of play it up and say that, oh, these are women. And yeah, they are women, but they're also soldiers. And so it's, I think, a little bit different than just capturing all civilians and having all civilians. So Hamas was really willing to release those 33 in exchange for a 40-day ceasefire. And the 40-day ceasefire was meant to be a period to continue diplomacy to eventually reach a permanent ceasefire. But the Israelis said that that was not an option, that they had to go in. They have to invade and destroy Rafah, even if it means, I guess, killing the hostages. Top priority is going in and destroying Rafah. Now, the significance of this is, of course, is that this is the last area in Gaza with any real infrastructure. So, the aid agencies, they have to establish safe houses. They have to coordinate with the Israeli government, like, hey, this is, a place where our people are. These are not in any way militants. Like, you cannot bomb this location. All these things take time, not to mention just toilets, right? Like, if you don't have toilets, think, I don't know if you've been to any libertarian or any festivals where there's maybe a few thousand or 10,000 people and the porta potties start overflowing. Like, things get nasty pretty quick. Now, imagine you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people and there's no toilets whatsoever. Like, and then of course this gets more serious than just being like nasty and smelly. Like, diseases start spreading. So we've had reports of serious ones such as diphtheria and hepatitis A spreading among children, but just overall hundreds of thousands of cases of like diarrheal and upper respiratory infections, largely just because of the lack of facilities. Of course, almost all the hospitals had been destroyed. So we're talking about removing the last of the operating theaters in Gaza, and just warehouses and things like that where they store food and then distribute it. Those have all been destroyed, and what's left is in Rafah. And so if the people are forced out of there, we're looking at mass starvation, I think, happening pretty quickly. There was a study done, again, this was by somebody at Kent College, so a fairly mainstream institution, believing that about 120,000 people would be dead by August.
Well, when you bring up the hospitals, I think that was the moment that I had tuned out, a little while ago, when they were fleeing and babies were left behind in the hospital. And at that point, my wife was probably 9 months pregnant, and I was like, I can't do this. Like, I just literally mentally cannot go down this rabbit hole, and just kind of turned off everything off at that moment.
Yeah. And just for the story you're referring to there, I think this was the Al Ali hospital where they forced, everybody to evacuate the hospital. They claimed it was being used as a Hamas base or something like that. So they force everyone out. Now, you can't just force everybody to leave a hospital on foot. If you're, a premature baby or something like that, without being in an incubator, you will die. And so the doctors say, well, we can't leave with the incubators, or we don't have the ability to like use those on the road. Like, what do we do with these children? And the Israelis said, leave them, we'll take care of them. Well, the second part of that never happened. And so not only did they leave them, they actually, the corpses ended up like rotting on the beds. Is absolutely horrific scenes. And this was something, when it first happened, I thought to myself, there's no way this is true. Like, people all the time, even on my side of issues, put out propaganda, right? There's been people for years who have been predicting the Ukrainian military is 2 weeks away from absolutely collapsing. Like, obviously that hasn't happened. Like, people on my side of the issue get things wrong too. And I didn't report it, didn't talk about it on the show, didn't touch it. NBC News confirms it, and they say, yeah, this actually did happen. And it's just one of those things that's so horrifying to know that this happened, and largely with U.S. tax dollars and other support that allows this to continue to go on.
Brutal. Absolutely fucking brutal. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening with Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah. So this war has been dragging on for 2+ years now. Is not going well for the Ukrainians at current standing. They're losing territory across most of the front lines, it seems, wherever Russia wants to apply pressure. Now, they're not walking through. Russia is still taking losses. They're still losing equipment, but they are gaining territory, and at a pretty good rate at this point. The Ukrainians are struggling on a number of levels. One, and I think most significantly, is manpower. And people think, oh, they'll just conscript more men, put them on the front lines, and this solves the problem. That's not the way modern warfare works. To have a troop be effective at all on the battlefield, they need probably 6 to 9 months at the bare minimum of basic training. Now, the problem for the Ukrainians is the way that this war has worked is everybody wants, it's kind of like Afghanistan, right? Where everybody is offering up a little bit of something. And so I don't know if most of your audience, I think the name of the movie is War Machine. It's the one about Stanley McChrystal based on the book. I can't remember. Anyway, sorry, Michael Hastings' book. Maybe I could send you a link to it or something. You could. And afterwards, but during the war, the Americans are lamenting that it's so hard to conduct operations in Afghanistan because the Italians are rotating out next week, and the Dutch won't participate in drug operations, but the Germans will only participate in drug operations. And this country doesn't have this, and that country won't do that, right? And so that's essentially how the Ukrainian war has been funded is, the UK will offer up 10 of their tanks, and then the Americans will say, okay, we'll match with 10 of our tanks. And the Germans say, okay, we'll match with 10 of our tanks. Well, a Leopard, a Challenger, and a Abrams tank are all very different platforms, and to have to operate all three and to maintain all three and have spare parts for all three, it's not equivalent. Just because you have 30 tanks and 10 of them are from each, is not the same thing as having a whole brigade of actually Abrams tanks, which most of the time they lack. And so this has also happened with the training. The French will train a certain way, the Dutch will train another way, the Americans will train another way. And so there's been a real lack of battlefield cohesion. So even if they did have those troops trained, they're not going to be as effective as they should be. And so the manpower, the deficit of training, I think is really the biggest thing Ukraine is lacking at this point. The next thing would be ammunition. And it's not just that, the Americans are holding out. Those dastardly Republicans led by Donald Trump screwed the Ukrainians. Boy, they had this war won, but Mike Johnson just wouldn't pass that bill, and we couldn't get them the munitions. None of this is true. So first of all, the Americans since last summer have been cheating on the budgeting here. I think what really happened is the U.S. ran out of funds to arm the Ukrainians about last June or July. And then the Pentagon said, we have an accounting error. And I'm sure some of your clients who may be familiar with like how accounting works and valuations and things like that, let's say that we have an Abrams tank in our armory. Well, how it's supposed to work is when Congress funds the president to be able to send that tank to Ukraine, is they give the president funding to buy a new tank to put in the U.S. Armory. But a year and a half into this war, the Pentagon decides, oh, no, we don't want to do our accounting that way anymore. What Congress actually gave us funding for was the value of the weapons when we sent them to Ukraine. So this Abrams tank, it was sitting here for 10 years. It's a little rusty, so maybe it's worth half of that. Well, this
so
means
they're depreciating the assets, and then
yes.
Holy Jesus.
And so then there's now a $10 billion deficit, right? Within our own accounting, the Pentagon needed an extra $10 billion at the beginning of this year just to replace the weapons that we had already sent to Ukraine that they had claimed that we had funded. So they've been cheating on this forever. But the biggest deal, of course, is they don't have enough of the weapons and they can't produce them fast enough what Ukraine needs. Russia is apparently outproducing the West, the collective West. So not just the US, but the US, UK, all of our NATO partners, and probably the G7 countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, 3-1 in artillery shells. And so the Ukrainians, they just can't get enough artillery, no matter how much money, $100 billion, $1 trillion. You can't shoot money at the other side. You have to have the chemicals, the primers, everything you need to put together these artillery shells and shoot them. And they absolutely cannot do that. And then so artillery shells and air defenses are the two things that Ukraine is really lacking that the West just can't produce enough of them for. And so that's the second major problem that Ukraine has. And then I think the third one is,
okay, before we get into number 3, one quick thing that you had said that really made a lot of sense to me is about the different types of equipment. I used to do a really in-depth, massive study on the aviation industry, and I was looking at different airline companies. And one of the reasons that a company like Emirates is so absolutely massively successful is they have like 2 aircrafts. They have 777s and they have 380s, and that's it. And when you look at some of the other major airlines in the world that I won't name, but are 319s, 320s, 321s, 330, 300s, 340, 500s, and 600s, 777s, 787s, 380s. And so they have like this massive fleet of absolutely random pieces of equipment, and you have to get type rated on every single one of those. All the crew have to be type rated on them. The engineers have to know how to handle it. So as your explanation about the tanks, it's not just the people who are driving it, but it's also the people who are having to maintain it. All of this type of equipment, it's not the same whatsoever. So if you have this mixed matched army of donations from other countries, that's not going to really work for you at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great point. And the last thing I was just going to add is I think Ukraine is hitting kind of a political dead wall here. The Americans are less and less interested in this war. And honestly, I think Ukraine's biggest problem might be Israel. And that is, look, the military industrial complex, the U.S. empire apparently has a ranking system, and Israel is at the top of the list. And so there's been reports over the last 6-7 months in particular that weapons that would have been bound for Ukraine, including those very critical artillery shells, have found their way to Israel instead. And this is really crazy, right? Because if we wanted to, we could tell the Israelis to knock it off in Gaza, or at least tell them to conduct the operations at such a slow burn that you don't need the artillery shells. Like, we'll find different weapons for you. You have fighter jets, things that the Ukrainians don't. But no, they're willing to take weapons that Ukraine desperately needs. What they claimed was like, the frontier of democracy and order in the world was Ukraine, and that's why we had to defend it to such a degree. And they're willing to take what Ukraine needs to defend itself and give it to Israel to conduct offensive operations in Gaza. Seems absolutely absurd, but that's actually what's going on right now. And so I think Ukraine is kind of coming to, people are less interested. Several of its even neighboring states have become less interested in arming or even helping to arm Ukraine. Slovakia and Hungary have said they're no longer going to do it. Zelenskyy really upset the Poles and the Romanians at one point by criticizing them at the UN over some wheat stuff. It actually had nothing to do with the fighting or weaponry or anything like that. It's just Ukraine has a lot of cheap wheat that they used to export through the Black Sea, and now they're sending it into the European Union, where the farmers have to comply with all the European Union Union regulations, and it's a lot more expensive to grow your crops. And so when the Ukrainians, and right now, martial law is in effect, so I'm sure there's no regulations on the economic sector. They're growing a lot of wheat. They're just dumping it on these markets. It's killing these farmers and things like that. And so this has created just other kinds of economic tensions in Eastern Europe that have created more and more just mounting problems for the Ukrainians.
Well, I'm not on the Russian side. I'm not on the Ukrainian side. I'm on the anti-war side for all of this. But I think it is pretty wild when mainstream media from the United States and Canada really portrays the Russians as these massive villains in the whole situation. And that, crazy Putin just did this out of nowhere and we never saw it coming. And he's just going to try to invade all of Europe and they're coming for your children. And it's just like, painting him as the boogeyman is just so one-sided and so comical in that, in how of a simplistic view of the entire situation it is. Are they still trying to, take no responsibility for their actions over the entire thing? Or have they finally come to the table and said, hey, we created this?
So both is somehow. So we've had actually American officials, even the Secretary General of NATO. So that's the civilian head of the alliance, Jens Stoltenberg, who I believe is a Norwegian, said that the war happened because Russia was concerned about NATO expansion. And so they've really admitted, and we've had American officials admit this too. I think more importantly, the admission that in April of 2022, so we're talking a couple months into the war, maybe there's a few thousand dead on each side at this point. Certainly there's some destruction done to Ukrainian cities, but no cities have been leveled. There's things could move forward from there. There's a deal on the table that the Ukrainians are willing to accept that actually returns the entire Donbass region to Ukraine. So this is the contested region in the east. Now, Russia keeps Crimea, which kind of was always going to be the situation. And I've heard this described as enforcing the Minsk II agreements at the barrel of a gun, which in 2015, after the Ukraine civil war initially broke out, the Minsk agreements were negotiated between Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France that said that, this eastern territory of Russia, because these people are all ethnic Russians and the Ukrainian government is doing things like outlawing the Russian language, they put restrictions on how many Russian movies could come out that were in the Russian language. And, this is just a really wild fact about all of it. Zelenskyy, the current leader of Ukraine, of course, is a comedian before actor, made what I understand is a pretty bad rom-com named Love in the Big City 2 that was actually banned in Ukraine because it was in Russian. This was before he was president, of course. But, just to understand how the extent of these language laws and the ethnic laws targeting Russia, this is why the people of the Donbass tried to secede and ultimately we're kind of in this Minsk Accord region, which gave them a lot of autonomy from Kiev because Kiev was looking to enforce this culture war on them that they didn't want to be a part of. And so that's really what Putin was trying to achieve, is that Ukraine agrees not to join NATO and that the Donbass gets their autonomy. That's why he wanted in the early days of the war. That's what Ukraine could have agreed to. But Boris Johnson went to Kiev with a message from NATO that was, we will back you. We will give you everything it takes for as long as it takes to defeat the Russians. And so Zelenskyy has this opportunity now that he doesn't have to agree to autonomy for the Donbass. He could retake the Crimean Peninsula and reconstitute Ukraine as it was in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union. This is what the West offered him, and he believed it. He took the deal, and it was a deal with the devil, like any kind of sitcom you've ever seen, where they take a deal with the devil that sounds like an absolutely perfect deal on the face of it, and it's really just a curse that absolutely ruins really the whole Ukrainian society at this point.
Wasn't Zelenskyy in one of his comedy routines known for playing the piano with his penis or something like that? Wasn't that one of his shticks? And it's like, this is the guy who got elected to president?
Yeah. Well, and another thing about Zelenskyy's career that's interesting is his famous TV show, Servant of the People, which is kind of the path that he takes becoming to president, is in Russian. And in fact, Ukrainians who spoke Ukrainian complained about the show because it was basically situation where all the nice, noble dignitaries speak Russian, but all the backwoods like yokels, they're the ones that speak Ukrainian. So anybody who was stupid would speak Ukrainian. Anybody who was smart would speak Russian. And part of this was because I think at the time, Zelenskyy only really spoke Russian. It wasn't until his presidential run that he even learned how to speak Ukrainian.
Wow. Massive PR campaign on that guy to try to turn things around and rebrand him as a hero. Unbelievable.
Yeah, as a war hero, but you know what I mean? He was not a good leader when he was wearing a suit and tie, right? Like in I think it was January of 2022, so about a month before the election, CNN ran an article that was titled something of, "Did the Ukrainian people make a mistake electing a clown as their president?" Right? In a three-piece suit, he was an absolute clown, right? It's suit and tie. This guy was a jokester. It wasn't until he put on the military garb and accepted the deal with the West that, suddenly he's this formidable ally, and you have these CNN or Fox or MSNBC ladies just gushing over what a good leader he is. And like, it's almost sensual at times of how much they love this guy.
So bizarre. Just can't believe what's happening in the world. Just a complete clown show on every level, nonstop. It's one of those things. It's like, I hear about this stuff. I listen to the podcast. I watch it, but I'm down here in Latin America where, none of this stuff is on the street. Like, I am so far removed from any of these types of things. And I just live my life. Like, I don't have to deal with these types of things or see it on mainstream media or, deal with people on the street who don't understand it and are trying to convince me of, the legitimacy of this clown world. And it's just like, I just love being an expat and not having to deal with any of this stuff.
Yeah, well, that's certainly nice, especially at a time like this when, you have pro-Palestinians who are protesting, in college and setting up encampments and things like that. They're really just trying to replicate what they learned about happening during the Vietnam War. And you have people on essentially every major cable network calling them pro-Hamas. Right. They're calling American college students terrorists, saying they're engaging in extremism. The New York Police Department claimed that they were reading a book about terrorism, which I don't think they actually wore, but there is a book about terrorism that's like a textbook that, to teach about the history of terrorism that the New York Times put out there, and that everybody in the media was like, "Oh my God, how could we allow our children to be indoctrinated by this?" And there's a good article out today by Branko Marchtic where he explains, if you read the book, it says terrorism does not work. Like, engaging in political violence is a mistake. And in no way does anything in the book describe at all what the kids are doing. They're not talking about protesting and barricading doors, which is about all the violence that these protesters have engaged in.
Well, it's pretty scary when your own government deems you a domestic terrorist and are coming after their own people. I mean, that is the sentiment that we seem to see back home in Canada and the United States. And it's just like so terrifying because it's like, things can escalate quite quickly here. And leading up to the election this year, I'm going to be as far away from North America as humanly possible because I just don't think it's going to be pretty at all.
Every day I kind of think about that more and more, that I think this election could really turn nasty, especially a lot of the rhetoric about the Republicans is they're the MAGA extremist or the far right extremist. And these words, are kind of programmed in Americans to trigger certain reactions, right? Far right extremism is dangerous because that's what Hitler was. And we, the kind of the founding ethos, the religion of the American empire is this World War II. We saved the day from the awful Germans. Never mind that we allied with the Soviets to do it. Forget that part of the narrative whatsoever.
Yeah.
No, don't worry about Stalin.
Go back to sleep.
Just everything bad is Hitler, right? But now they're talking and comparing the Republicans on a daily basis to Hitler. So if Trump wins the election, like, what are the Democrats willing to do to prevent Hitler from coming to power? Because that's what all their constituents now believe, because the politicians are just constantly saying it.
Well, I know a lot of people are just thinking, okay, if Trump gets in, then the US is saved and everything will be okay. But what about the backlash? Like last time when we saw this happen and, like legit domestic terrorist groups taking to the street, rioting, destroying property, hurting people, people dying. Like, I think their heads are going to freaking explode if Trump gets in. I don't think it's going to be a safe place whatsoever.
I want to agree with you. The only thing that makes me a little bit optimistic is maybe this war in Gaza, the onslaught that the Israelis are waging, and the fact that there's no daylight between Trump and Biden on this policy maybe will wake some of these people up, because I do think there are also some of the people that would likely take to the streets against Trump if he won. Like, are you going to, spend 6 months, 8 months protesting Genocide Joe, saying he's waging a genocide in Gaza, and then when he loses the election, you're going to go out in the streets and commit political violence against Donald Trump? That does seem somewhat unlikely to me. But I do know people who feel that basically the only thing about the country that's better under Joe Biden than Trump is the liberals are pacified.
Well, I hope you're 100% right. And I hope that no violence comes to the street. And I want to be so super wrong about this. I don't think I'm wrong. And I think that it is much better to get out of harm's way. I don't think this is going to be a pretty election at any point. And yeah, I don't think that this is going to be a good situation.
No, I completely agree. And, there's so many different kind of aspects that could happen here. Not to mention, we have two presidents that are two candidates. The top candidates are over the average life expectancy for American men at this point. And so, this could get very chaotic very quickly if somebody were to die, just even of natural causes, or any number of things could happen here that could really throw America into a lot of political turmoil. One positive thing, this just kind of goes to my other point. I did see there was a protest and then counter protesters over the situation in Gaza, and both sides started chanting "fuck Joe Biden" back and forth to each other. And so it's kind of funny that one side believes Joe Biden isn't supporting Israel enough and they hate him for it, and the other side believes he's supporting Israel too much and they hate him for it. But if it is the message of we all hate Joe Biden that brings this country together, that'd be a fine one for me.
It's a good thing to rally behind, for sure. Okay, well, let's move on a little bit and talk about China and what's happening in China. It's a country that I've visited many, many times, and I am, very worried about the situation and the escalation in the region.
Right. And look, I don't agree with a lot of what the CCP does either, or pretty much anything that they do. I guess they're a communist government and I'm a libertarian. So those are kind of like opposite political and philosophical positions. At the same time, I really don't care. They don't do anything that really bothers me on any basis at all. And they kind of want to leave America alone. I think it would be their preferred position to trade with the US, sure. And people could feel how they feel about like trade disparities and things about that. And certainly I think the way to solve that first and foremost isn't necessarily like China tariffs on Chinese goods, but just deregulation of the American economy and take the shackles off of the American business community so they really can compete with China in the global and even in the American market. But as far as what's going on, it's bad news. Now, you would assume everything I've talked about on the show, we're just saying they can't produce enough air defenses and 155 millimeter shells to wage the two wars that they want to wage in the Middle East and Ukraine at this point. So maybe it's a good idea that we tell the Chinese, hey, like for the next decade, let's just trade and try to be like as friendly as possible. No need to get into any military confrontation, but quite the opposite is happening. The war state, for some reason, believes that they need to prepare to fight a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in the coming days. And so they're, sending missile launchers, advanced missile launchers to the region. We're providing Taiwan with foreign military financing for the first time. And so that means, or at least the first time since we established diplomatic relations with China. So that would have been 78, 79. And the difference is in the past, we've sold them weapons, but now we're buying them weapons. And this is seen as a bridge too far for China, as well as the fact that we've just been sending them increasingly advanced warplanes, different kinds of ships and naval capabilities, as well as missiles and air defense systems. But I think where the real buildup isn't necessarily with China, it's with the Philippines, especially in recent months. There's the Second Thomas Shoal. So you have islands that are out in not quite the middle of the South China Sea. If you look at a map, they are a little bit closer to the Philippines. China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, they all have, if you look at it, it looks like a, maybe your kids scribbled on the placemat at the restaurant with all the different crayon colors at the same time or something. There's overlapping claims everywhere. But the US has basically said that we'll match anyone's claims as long as they're against China. And so particularly in the South China Sea with the Philippines, we've told them that we're going to defend their right to the Second Thomas Shoal, and then the seas around it, fishing grounds and things like that. And this has put Philippines and Chinese vessels not quite shooting at each other, but ramming each other, firing water cannons. This is starting to get very, very serious around here. I'm not sure that the U.S. is really willing to get into a shooting war to defend Philippine claims to the South China Sea. But at the same time, we should maybe take the Biden administration at their word because they keep saying they're going to do it.
Crazy. Absolutely crazy. So are they still sending like U.S. Coast Guard through the Taiwan Strait and all kinds of weird things like this as well?
Oh, it's worse than just the Coast Guard. The military does a Taiwan Strait transit at least about once a month. One of the big things the Biden administration has been trying to do is incorporate other countries into these transits. So the UK, Canada, Germany have all participated in these transits, either of the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. The US actually, so the US and China, Biden met with Xi last year in San Francisco. And for the Chinese, I think they really wanted to reset their relationship with the US and really went to San Francisco with the idea of we're going to reset our relationship with the Biden administration. And so there's been a lot of provocations going on, but at the same time, there has been some diplomacy going on in the background. Military to military communications. Janet Yellen went to China. Gina Raimondo went to China. Antony Blinken went to China. And so it did seem like, oh, maybe there's a little bit of this diplomatic path still being followed as well. Well, we just had the biggest meeting. I think it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs met with the top Chinese military official or something about that equivalent. And then 2 days later, the U.S. did an overflight of the Taiwan Strait, which is more provocative from the Chinese position as a Taiwan Strait transit with a ship. And then Antony Blinken went to China. He met with Xi. He met with the foreign minister, a lot of high-level meetings. And as he was leaving, he threatened China that they essentially have to stop business with Russia, industrial business with Russia, or the U.S. was going to start sanctioning China. And so, and look, you probably understand this a little bit better than I do. I think it's particularly for Asians, there's a sense of respect is very important in business, right? And so if you're going to have a meeting with me and then go and badmouth me right after the meeting, that's worse than just doing the badmouthing, right? And I think that a lot of these US actions have been particularly offensive to China. We have these diplomatic meetings and then we do something provocative. We threaten sanctions, economic war, military flight, military sales to Taiwan, all these things. And it's intentional on behalf of the Biden administration because of domestic politics. If they do anything nice with China, the Republicans are going to say, oh, there's Beijing Biden selling the American people out to China again. And so to cover his bases, he could never look that close to China and has to constantly insult the Chinese leadership. A good little small example of it is right after he met with Xi in San Francisco, he called him a dictator, right? Like all he had to do is not say that particular word. And he managed to do, even our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, like put his hand in his face and let down after Biden called Xi a dictator that closely after. But this is just what the American government has been doing, provoking China and making the situation so much worse. Oh, and I want to mention there's also the Kinmen Island, which is just a couple kilometers off the coast of China. I think you can actually see the mainland from the island, and we do have special forces, Green Berets, deployed there. They're supposed to be training the Taiwanese forces, but really they're there to act as a tripwire, right? They're there to tell the Chinese that if you attack this island, you're not attacking Taiwan. You're attacking the United States of America. You might as well drop a bomb on Hawaii, right? Because if we have special forces there, the American people are going to essentially see it as American territory. So if China starts dropping bombs, then American troops are in danger and we have to go and intervene militarily, again, just like we would if it was Hawaii.
Well, and I'm a Canadian citizen. Like the thought of Canada trying to escalate a war is so opposite of what we were raised as. Canadians are kind of taught that, yes, we have a military, it's a peacekeeping force. Okay, we were in both world wars, but that was to stop evil. But, we're really peacekeepers, and that's what we're here to do. And they're out there causing problems. Like, it's just, it doesn't make sense. And I don't think a lot of Canadians really realize that, we're not the good guys in a lot of this situation. The Canada and the US, we're not the good guys. We're the bad guys in this story. And that just makes me sick.
Yeah. We have a really great writer who sends articles to us at antiwar.com, Yves Engler, if anybody wants to look up his author archive. But a lot of his articles are, so America just spent $100 billion, say, on the war in Ukraine. They trained 1,000 soldiers. Well, Canada spent $1 billion and trained 100 soldiers or 10 soldiers, right? Like Canada does pretty much essentially what the US is doing as a part of the world empire, just to a far smaller degree. And then again, there's this weird, especially I know growing up in America, the idea is that the Canadians are like kind of pushovers, or, they don't really, beat their chest and fight like the Americans. Like, we're real men, they're nice guys. They're like the French or something.
Yeah, it's everything is upside down. Kyle, very, very interesting conversation today. Not a happy one by any stretch of the imagination, but a very important one. A very, very important one. Once again, to kind of reiterate my position on this, I'm not for Putin. I'm not for the CPP. I'm not for Ukraine or Israel or anything like that. I'm always coming down on the anti-war side. I'm for the victims. I'm for the women and the children and the people that are being harmed in these conflicts. I find the whole thing absolutely disgusting. And my perspective is get out of the way. Stop feeding the beast. Get out of this situation, move somewhere safe, get your family somewhere safe, and then let's move on with our lives. Like, you can't keep participating in these types of things. It is a scary, scary world at the moment. And I wish we could go backwards in time and just, we didn't have to deal with these things, but this is the reality at the moment.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. The only thing I just add, like on my part, the reason I don't spend a lot of time criticizing the Chinese government or the Russian government or the Iranian government is, one, I don't live in those countries. So they're not oppressing me in any way. But number two, there is a rally around the flag effect, right? And so if an American is criticizing the Russian, the Chinese, the Iranian government, not only is that maybe helping our country gain the political edge to start a war with them that I'm concerned about, but also if I'm an Iranian and I hear an American criticizing my government, I'm thinking, well, things really aren't that bad. Like, when the thing that makes me most likely to defend my government is when some Brits like, oh, you Americans are so backwards. Then I feel like I have this like internal compulsion just to tell them why my country is better than his. And so I don't think criticizing other countries or other leaders is really something that you should waste your time doing, because it doesn't really have an impact. It's just virtue signaling.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for coming on the show. If my audience wants to get a hold of you, if they want to find more about your writing or your podcast, where can we send them?
Yeah, best place to find me, just overall, everything I do, any show I put out, any article I write, always goes on my Twitter first and foremost. So follow me at Kyle Anzalone _. During the week, Monday through Thursday, Friday, I'm at the Libertarian Institute writing news stories, and at antiwar.com putting together the viewpoint section of the page. And then on the weekends, I write some stories for antiwar.com, always in the news section. So yeah, any antiwar.com, libertarianinstitute.org, at Twitter, Kyle Anzalone _. Oh, and I co-host a show, Conflicts of Interest, where it's, just covering news, foreign policy stuff, a little bit of my own take. I put out 3 to 4 mornings a week.
Amazing. Kyle, thank you so much for your time, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.